Giving a kid a timeout to teach them a lesson is probably one of the worst things that you can do, because neuroscience. Hey, if you're new here, my name is John, and I talk about parenting and specifically the neuroscience and behavioral psychology of parenting. I'm also a dad of 4, and my work revolves around teaching parents what's actually going on, neurologically speaking, underneath their child's behaviors so that they can learn to parent more effectively. And in this video, I want to talk about timeouts, because there is an uncomfortable truth about timeouts, and that is that even though they feel like they work in the moment, they are actually terrible tools for teaching our kids what we want them to learn. Once you understand what's actually going on inside the brain of your child when you send them away, I promise you're going to completely change how you think about timeouts and whether you actually think that they work. Here's what we're going to do in this video. First, I'm going to explain what's going on in your child's brain when we isolate them to teach them a lesson, and actually why we know or how we know what we know. Then I'm going to give you a very simple brain-based alternative that actually does work, so that the next time you feel like you should give your child a timeout, you will do this instead, and it will be 100 times more effective. So if you've ever wondered why timeouts seem to work in the moment, but then 10 minutes later or the next day, your child just does that thing that they got a timeout for again, this video is for you. I want to begin by taking us all the way back to 2003, when researchers were first beginning to understand what parts of the brain activated when different things happened to people. If you, like me, feel like 2003 was not that long ago, you're right. The things that we know today about the brain have basically all been discovered in the last 30 years. The thing that we're talking about today is a really boring game that researchers played with participants to help them understand how the brain processes isolation. The game that they created was called Cyberball, and participants believed that they were in an online multiplayer game where all they were doing is passing a ball back and forth to other human players. The key to the experiment is that only one of the players was actually playing this game, and they were the one who was the subject. I say participants believed because actually the only person who was really playing the game was the person being studied, and their brain was being scanned while the game was being played. At first, the ball was being evenly thrown between 3 players, similar to how kids would play on a playground. If there was 3 players, the ball would be passed to one, and then passed to the other, and then returned to the first player. But shortly after the experiment began, the player who was being studied was isolated from the game. The other players would begin to pass the ball back and forth between them, totally excluding the third player. The experiment only lasted a few minutes. They were never yelled at, they were never humiliated, they were just ignored. But the excluded person's brain showed something remarkable. The regions of their brain that activated during physical pain were also activated when they were ignored in Cyberball. And afterwards, participants voiced this. They reported feeling genuinely hurt by being excluded in Cyberball. They didn't say that they were irritated. They didn't say that they were bored. They said that they were hurt. But what's even more interesting is that when they were given the ability to reconnect with the other players, rather than telling those players that they felt hurt, they did all that they could in their power to restore the social cohesion. They would try and find reasons why they were excluded and pretend that they weren't going to do that next time. The exclusion that they had received increased their motivation to restore their social standing. That was just the mechanism in their brain trying to make sense of the reality of their circumstances. Let's shift this over into the parenting realm. So now that you understand this, it's not surprising. For all of human evolutionary history, the reason why humans survived is because they were able to maintain social cohesion with a tribe. In prehistoric terms, being excluded was a death sentence. That's why the brain evolved to treat it like physical pain. The reason why our brains respond to pain is to try and keep us alive. It's a survival mechanism. Similarly, the way that we respond to social isolation, both our kids and even us as adults in the case of Cyberball, is an adaptive way of trying to keep us alive. This is why the response to timeouts is often compliance. The emotional distress that comes from being sent to our room or ignored increases the motivation for us to restore connection, which means that their compliance will often spike. Not because the child actually understands the moral lesson that you're teaching them or why the behavior that they were engaging in is problematic, but because their brain is urgently trying to close that isolation connection gap that they're experiencing so that they can continue to exist in relationship with you. I love the way that Alfie Kohn says this in his books. Rather than talking about timeouts as some sort of discipline technique, he calls timeouts what they actually are experienced as by the child. He calls them love withdrawal. We often think that timeouts are just removing stimulation from our kids. but it's actually changing their perceived connection to us and their social standing. So that's what's actually happening in the brain. But you're probably wondering, like I did when I learned this, what are we supposed to do then? Timeouts are supposed to be an alternative to more problematic discipline techniques that many people used in the past. Discipline still matters. Boundaries still matter. How are we supposed to use those if we're not supposed to be using timeouts or social isolation? And that's where we get to the practical alternative. Again, I'm going to reference Alfie Kohn here, who talks about the best discipline as working with rather than giving your kid timeout. I'm going to ask you to do what the best coaches all over the world do in almost every sport, and take a timeout with your kid. A lot of you guys don't know this before because I haven't talked about it on the YouTube channel, but way back in college, I actually went to college on a scholarship to play volleyball. After that, I coached volleyball for several years before I started having my own kids, and it didn't really work for our life anymore. The reason I say that is because in all of my years of coaching and playing, what I've found is that basically the number one way to change a situation as a coach in the middle of a game, in a high intensity situation, is to take a timeout. But the goal of a timeout in sports is not to punish your players for playing badly. It's to bring the team together so that you can talk about alternative ways of playing going forward. Instead of sending your kid away, the next time they do something problematic, take a time out with them. Sit down with them, pause from the activity or behavior, and actually talk about what went wrong and what you can do differently going forward. For example, if your kid's at the park and they're getting escalated and they're starting to fight with other kids as the game gets out of control, simply take them over, sit them on a bench with you, and say, hey, I can't let you hit. I'm going to stay right here with you until we can calm down and come up with a better way to play this game. The connection will remain stable. You will still have an opportunity to separate your child from the situation so that they can calm down, but it will not activate those pain regions in the brain that actually reduce the ability that they have to work effectively with a solution. You can still hold the line. You just don't withdraw your presence as a form of punishment. While you're doing that, I encourage you to say the quiet part out loud. I didn't love that choice that you just made, but I still love you. Nothing that you could ever do can change that. What can we do differently if we want to go back and play? When their brain hears that, they know that their belonging and status with you is intact, that the connection is not going anywhere, and that they can come up with solutions to the actual problems that are being presented. Always remember this. If you try and correct before you reconnect with your kid, they are going to experience that discipline as further driving them into dysregulation. Always reconnect first, then teach second. It will make your whole life a heck of a lot easier. The last piece of this is that you get to replay the situation with your kid and make whatever consequences they are about repair rather than about removal or retribution. Instead of, you need to go to your room right now, you can ask your child, hey, what can we do to fix this? Restoration can maintain that connection while still requiring that your child take accountability. It keeps the baseline with you steady while they think about their behavior and how they can change that going forward. Here's the bottom line. Timeouts will often create compliance for parents in the moment. But the mechanism that is underneath social isolation creates pain for your child. It doesn't teach them any lessons about values. Once you see that, you realize that discipline is about instilling those values rather than simply controlling behavior, which, by the way, doesn't work because you're not going to be there all the time in order to modulate it for your kids. You can teach responsibility without forcing your kid into a feeling of, I don't know if I'm still going to be loved by my parents because of the things that I've done. So remember, instead of giving your kid a timeout, just take a timeout with them and use that time to reassess, connect, and figure out how they can reconcile and move forward using more helpful behaviors. If any of this was helpful at all and you want to learn more about your kid's brain and how to work with them instead of do to them, make sure that you subscribe to this channel so that you can get all of the videos that I'm just putting out for the first time, and also like this video so that more parents can know that timeouts don't actually work the way that they think they do. And if you're feeling like, wow, Jon, this is great, but how am I supposed to control my own emotions before I take a timeout with my kid? I'm super triggered. Don't worry. That's what my next video is about. I'll see you then.